In less than an hour, polls will close for local elections all across Massachusetts, with candidates in different cities and towns running for mayor, city council, and one special election for state senate. And of course, here in Boston, voters are choosing at least 4 new city councilors, with 10-term incumbent Michael Flaherty and 6-term incumbent Frank Baker stepping down in the preliminary defeats of Kendra Lara and Ricardo Arroyo. So what races should we be looking out for once the results start coming in? Helping me break it down is GBH News reporter and Talking Politics host Adam Reilly. Adam, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Tori. Good to see you. Good to be with you.
Hey, so there's a lot going on, and you've been covering all of it. What are some of the kind of key races? Let's start in Boston. What are some kind of key races that you've been watching, and just tell us about what you're seeing?
Well, as you mentioned, there's the at-large race and the district races for people to keep an eye on. I'm always fascinated by the at-large contest because, as many of our viewers will know, Boston has 13 city councilors, 9 represent particular parts of the city, and 4 run citywide, represent the entire city. As such, they have a little more, I think, political clout than their district colleagues. And the at-large seat, if you top the ticket in the at-large race, it tends to be a harbinger of big things to come. Michelle Wu topped the ticket a couple times before she became mayor. Ayanna Pressley topped the ticket a couple of times before she became a congresswoman. So simply for that reason, it's interesting to see who comes out on top in the at-large contest. In this particular race, with Michael Flaherty leaving, as you mentioned, former mayoral candidate and longtime city councilor Michael Flaherty, there's a pretty stark difference between the 2 people running to replace him. Henry Santana, I shouldn't say the 2 people, the 2 favorites running to replace him. Henry Santana is an alum of the Wu administration, a progressive in the Wu mold who's being backed by his former boss, not as far to the left as people like Ricardo Arroyo or Kendra Lara, but to the left. And then Bridget Nee Walsh, who's an iron worker from Southie, calls herself right of center, but open-minded. So there's been this divide on the council, very sharp divide for the past few months between progressives and moderates who might skew conservative. And the at-large contest is going to, I think, help determine the balance of power there. I should let you get a word in edgewise, by the way, because I can just keep on rambling for about 8 minutes.
Yeah, you're a host. You're used to this. I'm just letting you go.
Right.
You actually, when you were hosting Talking Politics, I think you had Yahoo Miller on from the Bay State Banner, and he said that he, looking at this race, feels that the city council is going to become less progressive based on what he's seeing in this race. What do you think about that?
You know, talking about the entire race, we've got the at-large contest, and then we've got a bunch of district contests. As you mentioned, there's Frank Baker, who's probably the most vocal conservative on the body. He's leaving after having been there a while. Kendra Lara and Ricardo Arroyo did not make it through to the final. I don't agree with Yahoo that the body is necessarily going to become more conservative, because if you take those district races, for example, each of those has a progressive running who I think ideologically would be at least somewhat similar to where the outgoing incumbent was. And then there's a more moderate candidate. So depending on how it shakes out, the council could become less progressive, or it could stay roughly the same. I think what might happen, Ricardo Arroyo and Kendra Lara both had a tendency to try to pull Mayor Wu to the left. And in those contests, those district contests, the progressives are people who've been backed by Mayor Wu. So what I think you might have is a council that isn't necessarily less progressive, but maybe less inclined to make the mayor's life difficult.
Yeah, I wonder about that in terms of the council's role in challenging the mayor. You'd mentioned Mayor Wu. I also wanted to talk about former Mayor Marty Walsh. There's a lot of big endorsements happening in Boston in this race. Can you talk about that?
There are. He has endorsed one of the candidates, John Fitzgerald, who's running to replace Frank Baker. Joel Richards is the other candidate in that district contest. Walsh has also endorsed Jose Ruiz. He's a former Boston police officer who's running for the seat that Ricardo Arroyo currently holds. Ruiz is running against Enrique Pepin, who's been endorsed by his former boss, Mayor Wu. So that creates this interesting dynamic where you've got the current mayor and the past mayor engaged in a proxy fight of sorts. I don't know how much it matters in terms of big picture stakes, but it will be interesting to see who wins that one, which of them in that particular contest at this particular moment has more muscle.
And there have been some other endorsements in races across the state as well. I know Governor Healy has endorsed a couple of candidates.
Oh, Governor Healy and Lieutenant Governor Driscoll have endorsed a ton of mayoral candidates. So that is, I guess, a meta theme that's going to be interesting to watch in this race, the success that they have or don't have when it comes to putting their preferred governing partners into office. I have a bad tendency, I think a lot of us in the political media do, to extract too much meaning from the way, say, one election shakes out. And we'll see how they do. See how the Healy Driscoll administration does when it comes to getting people they want in office into office. And then I'll try not to draw overly hasty or dramatic conclusions.
What are the most interesting races that you're watching of those mayoral races across the state? What has kind of struck you as really potentially changing the game?
I'm fascinated by the mayoral race in Revere. I don't know. Are you a Revere Beach goer?
Oh, yeah.
Did you make it out there? Okay.
I defended against my friends who grew up here and would never go there. So, yes, I am.
You know that in the past few years, there's just been this crazy amount of new construction on Revere Beach. It's almost like what we've seen in the Seaport, where if you were last there 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, you just wouldn't recognize it right now. In the Revere mayoral race, the acting mayor, Patrick Keefe, is trying to keep that job, trying to remain as mayor. He's running against a former mayor named Dan Rizzo. And Rizzo, one of the arguments that he's making is that Revere has just been building too much, that there's way too much new housing, that it's causing a drain on city services, schools, that sort of thing, creating traffic. And he has said that if he wins, he'd push for an immediate moratorium on new apartment construction. It's just one community which has had a certain kind of building going on over the past few years, but because there's such interest in Massachusetts statewide in ramping up construction of new homes to deal with the housing shortage, this is a really interesting case study in how the politics of that issue can play out, again, in just one particular community.
And it's an interesting problem to have as well, because that's not the case in most cities and towns across the state.
You're right. It's not the case. It's the opposite. They're not building. But Revere has been building a lot of new apartments. They're right on the shore. They're targeted toward younger residents. They're to rent rather than to own. A lot of apartments targeted to younger pet owners, which is sort of interesting. So yeah, it is. It's not representative of the entire state, but it's an insight, or will give us some insight into an issue the whole state's grappling with.
Just quickly to touch on something our colleague Katie Lannon has been covering, the special election out in Worcester County.
It's in the Worcester,
Hampshire district.
No, Worcester, Hampshire Senate district, and it's a chance for the Massachusetts Republican Party, which has sort of been at an all-time low in terms of influence. It's a chance for them to pick up a Senate seat. Peter Durant, their nominee, is running against Jonathan Zlotnick, the Democrat. It's a seat that was vacated by Ann Goby, who left to join the Healy administration. And again, it's just one seat, but the Republicans right now have 3 of 40 Senate seats in the state legislature. You can't do very much with that. So if they're able to pull out a win there, it will let Amy Carnevale, who's the new chair of the Mass Republican Party, it'll let her take a victory lap and say, hey, we've had a tough couple of years, but we're headed in the right direction. I don't know if it will give them momentum, but she will make the argument that it has given them momentum for more elections that are coming up down the road.
It's a big day for a lot of municipal races. I wonder if you're seeing excitement or engagement from a lot of people, from voters. It's not necessarily the Boston mayoral race, but are you seeing a lot of investment from people?
That's a really tough. It's a tough thing to gauge, right? Because you can see what looks like a tremendous amount of enthusiasm online, for example, for those of us who still spend too much time on the website formerly known as Twitter. And it doesn't necessarily correlate with enthusiasm in real life. But there are just one possible metric. There are a bunch of mayors, incumbent mayors, who do look to be vulnerable. So I think that vulnerability, based on what happened in the preliminary election in September, that alone suggests, I think, a notable measure of civic engagement and interest, which we don't always see.
Right. What do you think would be maybe the biggest shift out of all of this? Or something that you're just obsessed with? Some element of this that you're like, oh my gosh. It sounds like the Senate race out in the Worcester, Hampshire district is something we'll watch.
Yeah, I mean, but that wouldn't necessarily connote a seismic shift. To go back to Boston, which is the community that I've been following most closely and am most interested in, if in fact Yabu Miller, formerly the Bay State Banner, is right, and if in fact Boston voters elect a bunch of centrist candidates to replace outgoing progressives or outgoing centrists and conservatives, I think that'd be notable. I don't know that I expect that it's going to happen. But the question of whether the Boston City Council remains this staunchly progressive body or whether it tacks to the center, there I do think we'll get an actual accurate look at sort of the pulse of one community, politically speaking.
Great. Adam Reilly, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your coverage.
Good to see you, Tori.
Thanks.
Thanks.